One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I've been accused by my family that knows me well that I am too driven by my stomach. And I've been trained a little bit like Pavlov's proverbial dog, that every time 6 o'clock comes, I'm listening for that call that says that supper is ready. And at my house, when I was growing up, at 6 o'clock was it. And you dropped whatever you're doing. If you're playing football outside, if you're playing baseball, whatever you're doing, you had to come and eat at 6 o'clock because if you didn't eat at 6 o'clock, you wouldn't get any food. And I remember going camping at the Scouts with the Scouts, and when I was a kid, and the same thing happened there. The food was at a certain time. If you didn't eat, you didn't eat. There was no TV, there was no phone, there's very little distraction. Today we live in a different world. We eat, a lot of times families eat in shifts. We eat at 4:30, sometimes we eat at 9 o'clock at night. We eat around things, and there are lots of distractions. About 1 out of every 3 family members are looking at some device while they're eating or playing a game while they're eating. 1 out of every 3. And studies have actually shown that that the more you eat distractedly, the more you eat, period. So the more you use phones and devices, the more you eat in an unhealthy way, and the more you're likely to gain weight. We live in a distracted world, and it shows in so many ways, not just in the way we eat. It shows in the way we drive. This year I had to change insurance companies because my agent said my insurance company went up on their rates, as did a lot of companies in South Carolina, because the number of wrecks caused by distracted driving. Texting while you're driving, calling while you're driving, reaching for things while we're driving, adjusting the Bluetooth or adjusting the radio while you're driving. And 25% of all fatalities happen while people are distracted while they're driving. $10 billion in damage happened last year because of distracted driving. It's not just while we're eating or driving. The statistics are just a small portion. We are distracted. We are just distracted. We are a distracted society. We have so much entertainment, so many things out there for us to do and to go to, so many good things to see, and we can. And so we often do, and sometimes that keeps us from hearing God. It keeps us from hearing God's voice. speaking to us and calling to us to do something with our lives that's very important. And that's what was kind of happening with the disciples. The disciples were busy. They were pre-disciples. They weren't quite disciples yet, but they were busy mending their nets and fixing their nets and recovering from their fishing trip. They were distracted, and Jesus was over there preaching, and they weren't paying any attention. Actually, the story of Luke, I used to think that, so the disciples had just been fishing, and then Jesus said, drop your nets and follow me. And they immediately dropped, and they went back out, and they caught some more fish. That's not what happened. What happened is the disciples had been out fishing all night. They were professional fishermen, fishing all night long, and they caught zero. They were very discouraged. They were very tired. It's tiresome work throwing those nets out and reeling them back in. And they were washing their nets on the shore. They had no intention, I don't think they had any intention of listening to Jesus' sermon. But the crowd started gathering, and all of a sudden Jesus just hops in Simon's boat without even asking him. And then he tells Simon, okay, I want you to put out a little from the shore so I can have like a natural amplification onto the hill there. And so Simon did that. I'm sure he didn't want to do that. He was tired from fishing all night. He was mending the nets. It was a distraction to him to have to go and do what Jesus said to do. And Jesus preached. And all the fishermen stopped what they were doing and listened. They were dirty. They were tired. They were weary. But they did it anyway. And then Jesus had the gall to say, okay, I want you to go out and fish some more. Not just in the shallow part of the lake, but go out into the deep water. Now, back then, they didn't have motors. You had to row yourself out to the middle of the lake, to the deep water. So they were tired, and they did it anyway. And you hear a little frustration in what Peter said. It says, Simon Peter answered, Master, we've worked hard all night. The Greek says they toiled, they just labored really hard all night. And we haven't caught anything, zero. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. Because you said, I'm tired, I'm weary, I don't want to do it, I don't feel like it. But because you say so, I will go. And when he went, God changed everything. He went from zero fish to so much fish they couldn't even contain it in their nets, couldn't even contain it in their boats, had to ask for more help. When you listen to Jesus and you stop being distracted, but you do what he says do, God bears fruit in your life. See, Jesus has a way of solving our distracted living. It's by helping us to recognize that when we're distracted, our distractions will come to an end at some point. All the things we think are important that distract us from God will stop at some point. But the other part of it is his power kicks in to help us to see the purpose and the plan of God in our lives. So let's look at that a little bit deeper. The disciples said, we fished all night, didn't catch a thing. Jesus was a carpenter. How does he know where the fish are? But they listened to him anyway, and they had been distracted with washing their nets. So actually the net was not just a symbol of catching fish. There was a lot going on with a fisherman back in those days with trying to repair the net. So after you fish, you took the net back on the shore. You had to get the weeds out, had to get the rocks out. As I told my Sunday school class, you had to get the beer cans out. You didn't have their beer cans back then. But whatever was in the net, you had to take it out. You had to untie the knots. You had knots that formed. So it was just a pain to untie fishing knots. And then you had to mend the nets where they were torn. You had to wash them. Then you had to stretch them. It was a lot of work just to take care of the nets. And they didn't feel like stopping to listen to a sermon. but it was Jesus. And so they stopped. And because they stopped their distraction, God blessed them. Sometimes we just go on with our life and we think we've got to work hard, we got to work harder, we got to be better, we got to be good, we got to try this, we got to try that. And we forget about the power of God, and we forget how important putting God first in our life is. I want to tell you a story that I heard this week, and I don't want to use any names, don't want to embarrass a church member who told me this story, but it's a true story. The story is about a guy, I'm calling Joe. So Joe rented out places for a living, and he had rented it to this business person, and this business person didn't make a lot of money, was not successful, and so they folded up and they moved away, and they didn't pay their last couple of months' worth of rent. And they told Joe, we can't pay it. And Joe said, well, I'm not going to call the magistrate on you. I'm not going to arrest you or anything. But if you can pay it at some point, pay it. Months and months passed. And Joe's business itself, his own business, kind of went south. And he had a $10,000 tax bill due. And he didn't know where he was going to get the money to pay for those taxes. So he and his wife just stopped and they prayed and said, God, we can't do this. We're not able to pay this. We can't do it. They had to stop everything they did to focus on how to get that money. And the day before they were to pay their taxes, a check came in the mail from this person that owed them rent months and months and months ago, just at the right time. And guess how much it was? $10,000. Now you can say that's a coincidence. That doesn't. No, I think that was God at work. We fished all night. We didn't catch anything, and then all of a sudden we caught everything. That's God at work. That's how God works. Sometimes you got to stop your distractions and listen for God's call on your life, and then respond to that call, and He bears fruit in your life. So the other part of that, how Jesus stops our distractions, we see the power of God. Why were they willing to leave everything and follow Jesus? Why were they willing to drop their nets and follow Him? Why were James and John willing to leave their father on the shore and go follow Jesus? Because they knew Jesus was first. Because they had experienced that they couldn't do it on their own. They couldn't provide for themselves, but Jesus could. They went from 0 fish to boats full of fish, and they knew that He would provide for them. They trusted Him. And the question is, do you trust Jesus to provide for you, to care for you, to watch over you? Or are you still trying to watch over yourself? The power of God keeps us from being distracted. When we see that we need God in our life, that we're not able to do it ourselves, and His power is able to help us. It keeps us from being distracted. And one other thing I just want to note from this passage is when Peter saw this tremendous catch of fish, his response was, Lord, go away from me. Go away from me. And Jesus was trying to say, come to me, come to me. And they're saying, go away from me, go away from me. I'm a sinful man. But Jesus' job is to take us, sinful people, weak people, people who make mistakes, people who fail, and come to Him and find grace and help to get back on our feet and have fruitful lives in the end. Jesus, when you have an answered prayer, when you have something happen in your life that's clearly God working in your life, don't run away from God. Don't be afraid of God, but come to Him. He wants you to. That's why He's doing that kind of thing. He wants you to come closer to Him, to listen to His call, whatever He wants you to do in your life, to respond to that. Jerry was in my last church, and he became an elder in the church. And Jerry told his story about how he became a Christian. He said, I was always a good person. My parents never went to church, but I was always a pretty good, upright person, and never really drank a lot or did drugs, or I kept my life pretty morally straight, mentally awake, that kind of thing, like scouts do. And he said, but I I started my own business, and it was pretty successful, but then one day, one of my orders fell through. Somebody that I had counted on to pay their bill said they couldn't pay their bill, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he was about to be sunk into bankruptcy. And so he went to his wife, who was a Christian, and went to church, and he said, "Man, what can I do? What can we do?" She said, "Well, we've got to start praying." He said, "Prayer?" He said, "Yeah, we've got to stop doing and start praying." And so he said, "Well, why not? What do I have to lose?" So he started praying, and then miraculously he got an order in just in time to pay his bill of hundreds, thousands of dollars and keep his business afloat, which his business is doing great today. But it was because he stopped. He stopped trying to do it on his own, and he gave it to God, and God blessed him and helped him in his time of need. There's story after story after story in this church of that. You have your own story. If you've ever trusted in God, how God has seen you through the tough times and the sorrow and given you strength to help in your time of need. James West was the first organized leader of the Boy Scouts of America. And he was the guy who added into the Scout law brave, clean, and reverent. He added those things to the Scout law. And he also added something called the religious principle of Scouting. And it states in the charter, "The Boy Scouts of America believes that no member can grow into the best kind of citizen without recognizing an obligation to God." I totally agree. I mean, how do you grow to be a good person? The best thing, though, is recognize the power of God to help you to be good. You don't have to be good all on your own. You don't have to just keep trying and trying and trying and fishing all night and that kind of thing. But you can call out for God's help and for God's grace, and He will help you in your time of need. Christianity is not just humanitarianism. Christianity is focused on God and a recognition that God is the one who helps us when we have no help or ability or strength of our own. So I invite you to drop whatever net's entangling you and give yourself first to God and listen to His call or His purpose upon your life. What He wants you to do this week, this day, for Him. Amen.